June 6, 1944. The largest amphibious invasion in human history is about to begin. Over 150,000 Allied troops are preparing to storm the beaches of Normandy. But here's the problem that kept Allied commanders awake at night. How do you land 1 million soldiers, tens of thousands of vehicles, and millions of tons of supplies, on enemy shores, without a single working port? Every major port along the French coast was either destroyed by retreating Germans or heavily fortified and impossible to capture quickly. The invasion would need 12,000 tons of supplies. Every single day. So the Allies did something that sounds absolutely insane. They decided to build their own harbors. Not on land. Not after the invasion. But floating harbors that could be towed across the English Channel and assembled on the beaches within days of landing. The forgotten engineers who built D-Day's harbors. This is the story of the greatest engineering feat of World War II that almost nobody talks about. And the thousands of ordinary workers who pulled off the impossible. Let me set the scene. It's 1942. The Allies know they need to invade Nazi-occupied Europe. But there's a massive logistical nightmare. Modern armies don't just need brave soldiers. They need fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts, and reinforcements. Constantly. An army without supplies is just a group of people waiting to lose. Normally you'd use ports. But Adolf Hitler knew this too. He'd turned every significant port from Norway to Spain into a fortress. Cherbourg, the closest major port to the planned invasion beaches, was a concrete nightmare of bunkers and artillery. Vice Admiral John Hughes-Hallett put it bluntly in a planning meeting. If we can't capture a port, we must take one with us. Think about that sentence. Take a port with us. We're talking about harbors that could shelter ships from storms, piers that could unload tanks and trucks, breakwaters that could calm violent ocean waves. The kind of infrastructure that normally takes years to build. And they wanted to make it portable. The idea actually came from Winston Churchill himself. Back in 1917, during World War I, he'd proposed something similar for a Baltic invasion that never happened. Now, 25 years later, facing the same problem, he sent a memo that would change everything. Piers for use on beaches. They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Let me have the best solution worked out. Don't argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves. Classic Churchill. Don't tell me why it can't be done. Just do it. And so, one of the war's most ambitious engineering projects was born, Operation Mulberry. The plan was to build 2 complete artificial harbors. Each one would be roughly the size of the port of Dover. They'd be constructed in Britain, towed across the English Channel in pieces, and assembled off the Normandy coast. The design had 3 main components. 1. The breakwaters. First, they needed to calm the waves. They designed massive concrete caissons called Phoenix units. Picture a hollow concrete box. 6 stories tall. Weighing up to 6,000 tons. They built 146 of these monsters. The plan was to sink them in a line offshore, creating an artificial breakwater. When filled with water, they'd sit on the ocean floor and take the punishment of the Atlantic waves. They also deployed old merchant ships and decommissioned warships, called Gooseberries, sinking them to create additional barriers. And finally, Bombardons, massive floating steel cruciform structures that would bob on the surface, breaking up wave energy before it reached the inner harbor. 2. The pierheads. Next, they needed docks where ships could actually unload. They created floating steel pierheads that could rise and fall with the 20-foot tidal range. These weren't small docks. Each pierhead was massive, capable of handling multiple ships simultaneously. 3. The roadways. Finally, they needed to connect these floating piers to the beach. They invented flexible steel roadways called whale bridges. These could flex with the waves and tides but still support the weight of a fully loaded tank. Put it all together, and you had a complete artificial harbor system capable of handling the logistics of the largest invasion in history. Now here's where it gets really impressive. This entire project was built in complete secrecy, by tens of thousands of workers, in less than a year. Imagine you're a construction worker in Britain in 1943. You're suddenly assigned to a project. The pay is decent, but everything about it is strange. You're building enormous concrete boxes in dry docks and quarries scattered across southern England. But nobody tells you why. You're told it's for training purposes or harbor defenses. The security is intense. Armed guards everywhere. You can't talk about your work. Not even to your family. One worker later recalled, "We thought we were building fortifications to defend Britain against invasion. The idea that we were building something to invade them never crossed our minds." The scale was staggering. Over 45,000 workers were involved across hundreds of sites. They poured 330,000 cubic yards of concrete. That's enough to build a sidewalk from London to Edinburgh and back. They built in dry docks, in rivers, in quarries. Anywhere they could hide these massive structures. As each Phoenix caisson was completed, it was launched and towed to assembly areas. Meanwhile, other teams were fabricating the steel components. The pierheads. The roadway sections. The anchoring systems. British industry was working around the clock. The Germans knew something was being built. Their reconnaissance planes photographed some of the construction. But they couldn't figure out what these structures were for. Some German analysts thought they were anti-submarine barriers. Others thought they were parts of floating airfields. Nobody guessed the truth. By early June 1944, everything was ready. 400 vessels were standing by to tow the components across the channel. The largest maritime convoy in history was about to begin. And almost nobody knew what they were actually doing. June 6, 1944. D-Day. While Allied troops stormed the beaches under withering fire, the Mulberry convoy began its journey. Picture this: 400 ships and boats, towing massive concrete caissons, steel pierheads, and bridge sections across 100 miles of open ocean. Some of these structures were moving slower than 2 miles per hour. The crossing took over 24 hours. And the English Channel isn't exactly calm water. These structures were never designed for long ocean voyages. They were designed to be sunk in place. Towing crews had to constantly adjust for tides, currents, and the sheer unwieldy nature of what they were hauling. Some tugs broke down. Some towing cables snapped. Several Phoenix caissons began taking on water and had to be abandoned. But the vast majority made it across. The 2 Mulberry Harbours were designated for different beaches. Mulberry A would be built off Omaha Beach for American forces. Mulberry B off Gold Beach for British and Canadian forces. And here's what's incredible: they started assembling these harbors while the battle was still raging inland. Within 48 hours of D-Day, the first Phoenix caissons were being positioned and sunk. Within a week, the first pierheads were operational. Ships that would have had to anchor far offshore and unload supplies onto small boats could now pull right up to a dock. Tanks rolled off ships, across the whale bridges, and straight onto French soil. Ammunition, fuel, food, and reinforcements flowed continuously. By June 18th, both harbors were handling traffic. The invasion logistics that military experts thought impossible were working perfectly. And then Mother Nature decided to intervene. June 19, 1944. Just 13 days after D-Day. The worst channel storm in 40 years hit Normandy. 80-mile-per-hour winds. Waves over 20 feet high. The storm lasted 3 days. It was so violent that all Allied landing operations completely stopped. Mulberry A, the American harbor off Omaha Beach, was hit the hardest. The Bombardons broke loose. Whale bridge sections snapped. Phoenix caissons shifted. Pierheads collided with each other. When the storm cleared, Mulberry A was destroyed. Completely unusable. Hundreds of vessels were damaged or beached. The American harbor that had taken months to build was gone in 3 days. But Mulberry B, the British harbor, survived. Why? Better positioning in a more sheltered location. Stronger anchoring. And some historians argue, better construction techniques. The British harbor had been assembled more carefully, with more attention to the anchoring systems. The Americans faced a choice: try to rebuild Mulberry A, or pour everything into expanding Mulberry B and capturing the port of Cherbourg as quickly as possible. They chose the latter. Salvageable parts of Mulberry A were cannibalized to reinforce Mulberry B. American forces pushed hard to capture Cherbourg, which they took on June 26, though it took until September to fully clear and repair it. Meanwhile, Mulberry B, the harbor that survived, became the logistical lifeline of the entire Allied advance. Let me give you some numbers to understand the scale of what this harbor accomplished. From June to November 1944, Mulberry B handled 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, 4 million tons of supplies. In its first 100 days, it handled more tonnage than the entire port of Southampton. It proved that floating harbors weren't just possible. They were viable. The uninterrupted flow of supplies meant the Allies could maintain momentum. Armies could keep advancing. Tanks could keep rolling. Without Mulberry B, the campaign to liberate Europe would have stalled, possibly for months. General Eisenhower later called the Mulberry Harbours vital to the success of our initial operations. Field Marshal Montgomery said they were essential to the whole undertaking. Today, you can still see remnants of the Mulberry Harbours off the coast of Normandy. Phoenix caissons still sit on the seabed where they were sunk 80 years ago. They're slowly being claimed by the sea, but they're still there. Silent monuments to engineering audacity. So why don't we talk about this more? Why are the Mulberry Harbours a footnote in D-Day history instead of a headline? I think it's because combat makes for better stories. The bravery of soldiers storming beaches under fire is visceral, immediate, and dramatic. Engineering projects? They sound boring by comparison. But here's the truth: wars aren't won by bravery alone. They're won by logistics. By engineers who solve impossible problems. By workers who build in secrecy. By tugboat crews who tow concrete mountains across stormy seas. The thousands of people who built the Mulberry Harbours weren't soldiers. They were welders, concrete pourers, tugboat operators, and dock workers. Most of them never set foot in France. Most died without ever being publicly recognized for what they accomplished. But what they did was extraordinary. They proved that with enough ingenuity, determination, and industrial power, humans can build anything. Even portable harbors. The next time you hear about D-Day, remember this: behind every soldier who landed on those beaches was a supply chain. And at the heart of that supply chain was a floating harbor that shouldn't have existed but did. Because a group of forgotten engineers refused to accept that impossible means impossible.